Welcome back, Crunchy Take listeners. My name is James Kittapel. The following is a conversation I had with my great friend, Luke Wildman. Luke is a very gifted writer and storyteller, and in this episode, we'll be exploring at length the craft of writing, the journey he took to becoming a finalist in the Writers of the Future competition, and the basics of the publishing industry. Luke has written 4 novels and countless short stories, one of which can be found in the Writers of the Future Volume 37. To read some of his works and know more about Luke, please visit lukewildman.com. That's LUKEWILDMAN, lukewildman.com. Thank you, listener, for joining us today. And without further interruption, I'll let my friend introduce himself.
Like you, I grew up overseas. I grew up in Nigeria, and my dad's family was from Indiana. So when I lived in Nigeria till I was 19. And then when I graduated from college, I came back and was looking at schools. My dad's extended family lives about 2 hours away from Taylor. So that was part of what led me there. I also wanted to go to a professional writing program as opposed to like a creative writing program, which, was an interesting choice at the time. So yeah, Taylor was one of the only schools I found that was specifically focused on teaching people how to make a living in the publishing industry as opposed to how to do creative writing, because naive person I thought that I already knew everything there was to know about writing as a freshman in college. So,
What was your kind of first impression of, just like going back to college, like, because a lot of people, around this time, a lot of high school seniors are applying, and a lot of people are trying to figure out, hey, what do they want to do with their life? So if you can I've been in the past 2 or 3 weeks, just talking to different people, applying for different places and schools. It's kind of hard to take your mind back to freshman year to try to figure out, hey, like, do I still actually want to do this when I get to school? Did that feeling ever dissipate for you? Obviously it didn't, but like, what was it like when you first got there? Like, what preconceived notions versus what it actually was?
Yeah, I think like a lot of, like a lot of creative people have this weird mix of like arrogance and insecurity that seems like it always goes together. And I have that in spades. So I'm very easily intimidated by people. So when I started college, I, went from being basically the only person I knew who like was a geek about fantasy and loved writing fantasy to just like being surrounded by like 15, 20 people in my class who like all were just as passionate about it as I was. So I definitely had like that weird sort of rootless disassociation from what I always thought was my identity.
Mm-hmm. Did you, so you came in with a certain kind of identity, right? Like, and within the first 2 or 3 months, did you ever feel like that was changing at all? Like, did you, like, being surrounded by like-minded people and like not like-minded people, which is kind of the point of college, you go to challenge yourself, but to also challenge others. Did you feel like it helped? Did you feel overwhelming negativity or positivity going like right off the get-go?
You mean from the community?
Yeah.
Yeah, it depends on the community, really.
Right.
I'd say most of the other pro-writes were pretty, like, we're all pretty weird. So it was just kind of a found family sort of situation where we fit together because we didn't necessarily fit in other places. That's not like universal to every person there. And the rest of the school, I think it did take me a little while longer, as I think it did you, to like kind of feel like I belonged at Taylor, and feel like I because I really didn't understand like U.S. culture very well, and so it took me probably a good semester and a half before I even had like this faint grasp of what U.S. culture was, and then it was longer than that before I realized that actually Taylor was not representative of U.S. culture. So kind of had to relearn that a couple times.
Yeah, and the reason I asked, and the reason I kind of harken back to those first initial months, right? Because varying experiences of people's experiences inform the way they write and inform writing without question is like an extension of your body. It's like an extension of how you express yourself to the world, and that can be molded by your experiences. So like the first few months of you being independent from your parents, for one, is, and granted, now not everyone comes into college with that specific experience in mind. Some people may have been separate from their parents for way longer,
right?
But like I feel like 8 years ago, for a lot of people, or when they first go off to college or when they're first independent, that's when it really starts. That's when you start to really develop your palate, develop your tongue.
Yeah, I like what you said about like that sort of experience of like transition being such a transformative thing for like creatives and writers especially. Because I think we both have similar interests in books. I know, like we both like Lord of the Rings. We're both just like,
the difference is you capitalize on those interests and you read way more than I do.
I don't know about that. But I think a lot of what that upbringing did to me was it gave me this sense of unbelonging, like this sense of not being Nigerian and also not being American, right? So like my life, I've realized, has been shaped by stories that are about people who also have that sense of unbelonging. So Lord of the Rings, you have these characters who are discovering that the world is a lot larger than they think it is. The Hobbit as well, that's a great example of that, or like Narnia, or The Wheel of Time, or even something like Dune, not quite at the same... It's not the same arc, but I think it hits on some similar themes of someone transitioning into an environment that they're just totally unfamiliar with and adjusting to that culture.
The reason I'm asking you these types of these type of questions, as far as kind of nitpicking where you draw your lines and your morals and your policies from, is because when I was a creative writer in college, I really, really struggled with this. I struggled so heavily. And as a lot of beginning creative writers do, especially when they go off to college or even in high school, you're trying to make a story. What I did was and my method was extremely flawed, but the idea was I made everything artificial. And I didn't tie it down. It didn't have any gravity, which is what I feel a lot of beginning writers have.
Can you define that artificial?
Yeah, artificialness is like I would write characters that would be very one-dimensional. Like I would describe their appearance as you would, like, because I don't know if there is truly a class, both in high school or in college, that can teach you how to write. This is an endless debate across that many different writers have had, whether, innate talent versus, how to get from point A to point B, how to go from learning how to write, from a just like personal standpoint, like, academia to actual creative writing.
Yeah.
I struggled mightily with that transition just because my process was flawed, but then also my experiences were also they informed the way that I wrote characters, and in some ways, it's amazing to me when people break those norms, when people come from extreme hardship, extreme family life and personal conditions, are not able to step above that and still create three-dimensional, really interesting, engaging characters.
Yeah. And part of that's just growing pains. It's what we all struggle with when we're starting out in any art form, just grasping those technical skills. The thing about whether writing can be taught, it's really interesting because, I struggled with that for a while too, but I've now realized that the only people who really say that it can't be taught and say that it should always just like flow out of the soul or whatever, the only people who say that are like people who are either haven't been writing for very long or have been writing for a long time and haven't really like sat down and learned the fundamentals and like maybe haven't had too much professional success either.
Oh, it's interesting that you describe it that way.
Maybe I'm wrong about that. Like maybe there are a dozen people out there who are going to hear this and be like, no, he's absolutely wrong. I've had this success and I don't believe writing can be taught. But yeah, and the longer I've been doing this, the more I've moved from a place of thinking, oh, it all has to be natural. I have to like just write from within, to like reaching a place of, oh no, I can learn like these strategies and I can add these things to my toolbox. And that's actually what makes a professional, right? It's having consistency and having, those abilities to not just like produce something of quality, but to produce it every time. And so that was something that I had a lot of frustration with over the last few years. And it's only within, honestly, the last year that I feel like I've reached a place where I can consistently always get my stories to a level where I'm happy with them being.
So it's interesting that you describe it that way, because I can see the patterns and kind of similarities between developing your writing and developing your palette to working out.
Yeah.
And this was a point that was that I got beat over the head with in college, and I really do believe it now, is that writing is a muscle. Aaron Householder, God bless him, he preached this. Him and others like him in college that the wonderful creative writing professors that I had the pleasure of working with, despite not performing very well.
I don't know about that.
Writing's a muscle, and you have to work at it. You have to get and this is why I'm very fascinated by your schedule. You set a time for yourself to get up in the morning and write. How early on did you do this?
So yeah, that morning writing period, I've shifted my system around quite a bit depending on the needs of my life at any given time. So right now I'm not writing in the mornings. I'm writing after I work out in the evening. I usually write from 8 until 10-20, something like that these days. But as far as the morning writing, that was an attempt on my part to trick my brain. Because being overly analytical of what you're writing, it's funny because I was just talking about the need to get these tools and treat it like a craft, but now I'm gonna walk that back and say being over analytical and editing yourself as you write is the enemy of creativity. So waking up at 4 a.m, which I was doing for a while to write, that I would just wake up, immediately sit down at the table. Maybe I would have some coffee boiling in the background, but I would just immediately sit down and start to write. And so before I even had a time, the analytical part of me had a time to wake up and think about things, I was already just halfway through a page of writing. And so that can be really valuable.
I'm seeing way more similarities than I even initially thought, because it's almost there's different times or different types of exercises that you have to do. Right. Okay. If we're making the workout comparison, it's kind of going from high entropy workouts to just heavy weight. You can't do that on the same day, but then you have to have the appropriate time to do that.
Yeah.
You write different content / your mind is in a different place depending on your schedule throughout the day, right? But you need to allow yourself to have these experiences. You need to allow yourself to have that time in order to come up with something that you may not have otherwise had if you hadn't set that habit beforehand.
Yeah, and just with working out. So I don't know the science behind all of this, but I've heard I think Dave Wolverton, who's a New York Times bestselling author, say that your brain goes through cycles throughout the day. And I imagine this actually relates pretty closely to the time frames in which people have their best workouts as well.
Right.
So your brain goes through these cycles, and at certain points of the day, you're actually most creative and most alert, and your mind is able to free associate. And so when you start paying attention to that and figure out what that time frame is for you, and then try to sync your writing schedule up to that, you can get lots of great results. So for me, I have when I started paying attention to that, I noticed that I would get my best ideas around 10 a.m. And so, and it wasn't just that I was that was when I was sitting down to write. It was even when I was still at work, that's just when the ideas would start to flow. And so in addition to that 2-hour writing period in the evenings, I also use all of my breaks and my lunchtime to write. I'll immediately just start typing. And that can be really valuable as well, because then I'm also forcing my brain to just be I have to spit out, I have to finish the sentence before my break ends,
Wow. So what, it kind of a pivoting question to make the comparison to working out. What would you say is the dieting of the writing world / the cardio? Kind of the tougher, I mean, because in the workout world / when a fighter is preparing for a fight, dieting is one of the most crucial. He has to make weight. you know. And so for a professional writer such as yourself, what comparison would you have to make? What is like the more difficult aspect of writing that isn't really talked about but yet is really, really essential?
Oh, the more difficult. Okay.
Yeah,
So not in terms of like a direct comparison, but in terms of
like difficult.
Okay, gotcha.
Yet like you really have to put elbow grease into it, and you have to make it a habit.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that is just the sitting down every day. Some of it is, and I guess this is more specific to dieting, some of it is forcing yourself to read things that stretch your comfort zone and to write things that stretch your comfort zone. So like you're reading Dune right now, and that has some challenging stuff in it. Like that can be hard to focus on. But like I've heard a lot of writers say that then when they are working on a certain type of project, they will only read books that are similar in tone and style to what they're working on. Or conversely, I've actually heard other writers say that when they're working on something, like let's say they're working on a historical fantasy that maybe has like a pseudo like gothic like tone and voice. Some writers will actually avoid anything that resembles that. Like they will only read like, let's say like nonfiction or something so that they don't like ingest another writer's style and voice. For me, because like the last novel I wrote took like a year for my first draft or something. And then, you know, I was also working at the time and writing a bunch of short stories. So my next few drafts were spread out over a couple of years. So I didn't want to just like stop reading like something entirely or like only read one type of fiction during that whole time. So I don't do that, but I do notice a difference in my prose, depending on like if I'm reading Dostoevsky or something, then I will like start to have these much more elaborate sentences and characters with this like weird like dialogue voice that doesn't fit at all, and I have to go back and change it later. But yeah,
the comparison there, like for me, you know, because writing comes across differently to different people, you know. So for me, what it sounded like was you were listening to records. As an artist, you were if you're trying to go for a darker tone, you might listen to like a darker record or whatnot. And, you talked a little bit about challenging yourself as a writer and challenging yourself as a reader. How important is it in your opinion, is it to read as much as you write? You know, like, 'cause it's the whole. The reason I asked this, it's kind of like, because when I was a jazz student at Taylor, or when I was in the jazz band, we went to a festival in Elmhurst, Chicago. And there was a conference, a workshop that a very famous jazz artist was giving. And what he was saying was, you need to be listening to records, tons and tons and tons and tons of records, because your ear, you have to be able to hear something before you can play it. Or you have to have that in the back of your mind so that when you reach into your tool set, you'll have it as an extension of yourself, you know?
Yeah, and I think just as important as as being able to steal things like steal tools and ideas from records, which is a great thing about it. It's also important to just know what sounds right and what sounds wrong. And it's the same thing with reading, you know? You have to know. That's one frustration that a lot of beginning writers and like artists and whatnot have, is their palette is so much more sophisticated than their abilities. And so it's like when I was writing my first 2 fantasy novels, my first 3 even, I had read all these great books and I knew this is good writing. Like I could look at a book and be like, oh, this is awesome, I want to do this. And it seems so simple when you're doing that, when you're reading, and then you sit down to try to create something like that, and you're like, oh shit, I don't know any of this, I don't know anything.
It's, oh gosh, I hate to be the comparison guy, but it's almost like when, as musicians, you know, when they sit down or when they, depending on what instrument they play, the hard part, the easy part is practicing the easy, quote unquote, easy part is to go listen to the record. The hard part is taking what you're doing with your hands and make it music. Yeah. You know, it's the same thing as when you guys sit down to write. Like the easy part is not easy, but the more straightforward part is to just sit down and write. But the hard part is like turning that into your vision, to capitalize on your vision or what the ultimate product can be, like it's a big gap.
I would actually say I have the opposite struggle.
Ah, really?
And I, for a while, assumed that everyone struggled in the same way I did with this. And I'm just realizing that that's not true. But yeah, for me, I usually have an idea of, well, I'm not, this is going to be hard to articulate. So I'm not an outliner. I don't always have like that big picture plan, but I don't have much trouble shaping the big picture of the story into something cool. It may take me a few drafts to do that, but I can usually get there. On the other hand, though, like I have a high value for like really well put together sentences and prose that like is distinct to the character voice and, vivid and clear and evocative and all that stuff. And that's the thing that looks so simple when I see other writers do it. And that is the thing that I really, really struggle with. Mm-hmm. So actually, if I can get kind of personal for a second, that was one of the actually difficult things about attending Writers of the Future, which I guess we haven't gotten to yet. But I attended this workshop a few weeks ago. That's a really well-known workshop, some great writers there, and all of my fellow winners who were there were amazing. And one thing I struggled with was realizing that, hey, for once I shouldn't say that. That makes me sound arrogant. I wasn't the person in this space who was really great at producing nice sentences and like producing, because when you're an undergrad in college, most of the people around you are what we just described. They're people who have a good palate, but they haven't necessarily developed the muscle memory and the skills yet. And so, but at this place, at Writers of the Future, I found that I was no longer the person who produced the great sentences and maybe struggled with the plot. It was actually the opposite. Like, people were really connecting with my ideas. But my sentences, especially since I'm not naturally a short story writer, I'm naturally a novel writer where you have more time to go back and it's not a sprint, it's a marathon, So I was finding other people were naturally short story writers, which I hadn't really ever been around before. And I was the one who was sort of fighting above my weight class here, which was a good feeling. It pushed me.
At what point did you feel that start to turn for you as far as like going from, the writers, you said, crafting beautiful sentences, really articulating good prose, to having people be hooked to your concepts and ideas. That to me is like the next level almost. There's tiers to this, there's levels to this, when you can read a book from, name your favorite author. At some point you transition, if you endure enough and if you persevere enough, it sounds like you transition from a point where I'm just writing this to, hey, like people actually people might get upset over if I like go back on this concept or if I kind of break the lore or whatnot. Like there's a level that kind of switches. At what point did you feel like you made that transition?
So that's interesting because it's actually something I'm just finding out now. I'm just realizing that I may actually be stronger with ideas. Okay, I actually shouldn't say ideas and concepts because I'm a fantasy writer more than a sci-fi writer. So okay. I'm not the guy who has the really big, hard sci-fi, like figures out the physics of the planet or whatever. I'm the person who figures out how to weave the plot in such a way that it's pulling the reader along, and in such a way that that like it can evoke those emotions in the reader. So one of the things that I think made that switch for me was, like I said, I thought for a long time that prose was my strong suit and plotting and ideas were my weaker point. And so I started reading dozens of books on how to craft a good story, how to plot. I don't like using the term formulaic because most of the time when people denigrate something as a formula, what they actually are talking about is something that's a tool. But at the same time, I actually don't typically follow much of a formula. I follow like your big picture structural things, so like your 3-act structure or like a different sort of structure. But I have found now through reading books of like Dave McKee. Have you heard of him? He's a screenwriter in Hollywood.
What has he written?
I've only read his books about writing. So I read a book called Dialogue, I believe. I read a book called Story. I may be getting these titles wrong, but his name is Dave McKee, and he writes the most brilliant books on like the mechanics of putting together a cohesive story that I found. He's great. So I've read these dozens of books, and yes,
Gotcha.
that's him. Sorry, James just pulled him up on the computer for all of you who are listening. So yeah, I've read all these books, and I think I've ingested a lot more of that than I thought I had. But now what I'm finding is I need more flexibility in my prose. Like I can write clear sentences, and I can do all the mechanical things. I can even write beautiful sentences at times, honestly. Like I can write good portions of books. But what I need is the flexibility to be able to like vary it to the character voice and vary it to the book and like vary it to the needs of the scene.
So it's almost like, hey, it's that discrepancy, or ability to be able to decipher, hey, like, would that character really say that? Would that character realistically do that set of X set of actions or whatnot? Which is a problem with a lot of books and a lot of kind of movies that are tonally inconsistent.
And I'm actually talking more internal than that.
Okay.
So not just would that character say that, but would that character think that? And not in terms of like italicized thoughts, but in terms of like, so when I am writing
his ethos.
What?
His ethos, like really deep down kind of the idea.
Yeah, I haven't heard that word. Hesitos?
Ethos.
Ethos.
Yeah,
Gotcha. Yeah. Yes, exactly. So when I'm writing a character who is like more the straightforward thinker, like they approach problems in like a very direct way, I try to make the sentences in the narration in their sections of the book reflect that. Like sometimes they're they have their quirks, but they will be like more straightforward sentences. Whereas sometimes I'll have characters who are more, they don't attack problems head on. They like will circle around problems and avoid conflict, like outward conflict, but try to find another way of getting things done. And for those characters, I try to make their like sentence structure, like not just sound like their dialogue, but also like sound the way that you could imagine this person thinking. And I don't always succeed at that, but I'm trying to do it.
That is a curious reflection of the cultures that we come from, because how different cultures attack and take problems head on. Like the archetypes I think about are Jocko Willink, who is a well-known kind of Navy SEAL, and his philosophy is all, if there's a problem, good, you tackle it aggressively,
the brawling warrior,
right? Versus some more Eastern cultures, they have this kind of circling around. They'll kind of dance and get a little closer and a little closer and a little closer to the center because there's maybe a common courtesy thing. It's an interesting reflection of the cultures that I'm just repeating myself at this point, but like how often do you find yourself like restricting real life experiences versus like letting the events in the book or events in your story manifest themselves?
I'm not sure I understood that. Restricting real life experiences?
Yeah, so like it's often I find people we were talking earlier about taking your experiences in life and or your own experiences and letting it inform your writing, but at some point, like, do you ever think at some point does that ever stop, and does that what you're writing, does it like kind of manifest in itself in your book and the events that you've already written or like take place, and you kind of have to take your place to your mind to an alternate universe? I'm not framing the question really greatly.
Yeah, I'm getting it more. Let me think. So to me, and maybe other people have a different answer about this, but to me, the basis of creativity is taking two separate things or more than two separate things that are not necessarily related and combining them and finding a way to connect them. So it's like, you take dinosaurs and you take a theme park and you connect those things and suddenly you have Jurassic Park. And it's so, a lot of the best ideas come from like things that are not related. To give a more tangential, or not tangential, but a more tactile example of that. A few months ago, I, with some friends, got to visit a place called the House on the Rock in Wisconsin. Have you heard of it?
Oh,
Yeah.
Well, I saw pictures of it. You went with Joseph.
Oh, yeah. I went with Joseph
Yeah.
and Liz and Emily and Lauren. And so the House on the Rock, I knew about it because it features In American Gods, a book by Neil Gaiman. But it's just this, it's not a museum. It's sort of a tourist, I mean, it is a tourist trap, but it's not only a tourist trap. It's sort of an artist studio.
Yeah.
It's like a little bit of everything. So it's this place where this guy who was just apparently his mind worked in interesting ways. He just collected things that sort of inspired him creatively, or not even like to use them for his work, but just like these things connected with him somehow. And he just like bought up thousands upon thousands upon thousands of just the randomest crap. So you can walk through a room and see like a little like ceramic frog sitting next to like some old-fashioned like toy baby dolls, you know, like next to like an ancient calliope. Are you looking at some pictures there?
I am.
It is
oh my
hard to
goodness.
describe the level of just like delightful weirdness. And what was really interesting was when we got out of the House on the Rock, you know, I am normally drained by being in crowds. Like I'm not a terribly social person, and I get exhausted really easily by being around a lot of people. And this place was just packed and totally crowded. But when we, you just pulled up a picture of I think that's like a giant kraken.
That is insane.
Oh, that's a whale. And there's that ship that you see there. That is a full-sized sailing ship. Like it looks small, right? But that is a full-size sailing ship.
Oh wow!
And that's to give you an idea of the scale of that monster. And then there's like a kraken whose tentacles are like wrapped around the thing.
So wait, is this we're to people listening right now? We're looking at a picture of this. Is that what the place looks like?
So and
Kinda
it goes
like an
on
outhouse?
so much further than that. This place is huge.
Man, it's not what I imagined at all. That's insane.
Yeah. So what's interesting is the guy did not have an idea when like he didn't have a plan when he started building.
It looks like it.
He built like a hallway, and then built a room at the end of the hallway, and then just built like 2 more hallways, and some of them have stairs and go up hills, and some of them go down, and there's just like really
It
and
looks
just,
like a Minecraft.
Japanese gardens in the middle of everything,
Yeah.
and like all sorts of weird stuff.
To people at home, I would definitely Google it, the House on the Rock, and I now have to go visit this place.
Yes,
because
absolutely.
Look at it. Looks like it's a Japanese garden with the, like you said, in the. What inspired the architecture of this place? And like, because it takes money to build it, and so like how do you convince investors, hey, this is a good, because that's basically real life Minecraft. You just keep
as
adding
far
on
as I
top
know,
of it.
he didn't have investors. He built it himself.
What?
Like by hand. He had like one person he hired because he worked for a construction company, so he had like some knowledge, but he like put his own money into this, just built it like one thing at a time as he had money to do it. It is super bizarre. But what I was getting at there was when we came out of the House on the Rock at the very end, I'm normally drained after an environment like that.
Yeah.
But I was actually super like pumped up and talkative and chatty the whole drive back, and the people I were with were all just like brain dead and exhausted. And I think the reason for that is like we were saying, there's that idea of free association, of taking things that are completely dissimilar from each other and just like cramming them together. And to me as a writer, that is a very natural place to be and a very natural thing to do. So I was used to it and it invigorated me. But to the other people I went with, like your brain struggles to like process that much stimuli all in one spot. And so they were just like, completely worn out.
What's a good example of that in the writing world? Because in various different practices, there's so much you could draw from cooking. You do that all the time. Like I have two, God bless them, I have 2 great uncles that are in the food industry, and they combine flavors all the time that I wouldn't even think of. You know, or in art, in visual art, especially in filmmaking or in painting, great concept artists or whatnot, they'll take stuff that doesn't belong together. But in the visual, in the writer's sense and in the literary sense, where do you see that? What are some really good examples of that, both from you or from authors you like?
Yeah. Let's see. So, there are different ways you can apply that. You can do it stylistically by like just contrasting totally different styles in the same book, and sometimes that just feels jarring, and sometimes it creates a great effect. It kind of depends on how commercial you're trying to be versus like how sort of new wave avant-garde you're trying to be. You could do it with the story archetypes that you're putting into your book. So what I'm working on right now, my like internal headcanon for it is it's the Gilgamesh epic meets Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. So they're, two very, very different things, but I'm trying to do it in such a way. The challenge is to do it in such a way that they feel natural going together. And so examples of other writers who do this really well. I mean, I mention him all the time, but Neil Gaiman.
You've all but sold me on him. I just haven't. Real quickly, what book would you recommend just to start him right off?
To a starter?
Yeah.
Someone who hasn't read him before?
Yeah. Entree to Neil Gaiman.
Yeah. I think The Graveyard Book is one of the books that touches me most deeply. Like it's a wonderful, amazing book. Right. American Gods, I personally think is his most brilliant book, and I think you would appreciate it. But a lot of people, that's a controversial one. A lot of people don't love that one. Anansi Boys is another one of my favorites. Actually, Anansi Boys might be best, and it might be the best example of what you're talking about right now, because Anansi Boys is comedy with a lot of horror in it. And those two go together very well, actually. Comedy and horror are two sides of the same coin. But yeah, it's comedy horror, but it also like it reaches this place where it's just like pure surrealist and just like new wave, and like but Neil Gaiman has a special talent for doing that in a way that doesn't alienate the reader, which is not many writers can do that. Even Stephen King, I don't think, always manages to do that without alienating the reader.
A good example from your work, a short story you once wrote was a story called Citizen Beep, or Scarlet Citizen.
Oh yeah. Right. For class we were both in.
Yeah, and you ended up using that to publish. You tried to publish that several times, right?
Yeah. I've submitted it a few places.
Yeah.
So funny story. That was actually the very first story I submitted to Writers of the Future, and so that got me my first honorable mention for the contest, and that was the thing that got me to decide I was going to submit every quarter, and that ultimately led to me growing as a writer and winning.
We're about to quickly segue into that, but like the vibe that I got from that story was very steampunk versus. I got a steampunk vibe, and I'm a sucker for good steampunk stuff.
Right?
I'm a huge BioShock Infinite fan, and whatever else. And so it was steampunk versus almost like Les Mis, like a weird one guy going into like this thing and trying to solve a problem. And for me, like it definitely challenged me as a reader, though, because I can watch a movie like Parasite, right, which is directed by Bong Joon-ho, dark Korean comedy. Dark comedy that won Best Picture, right? But it was a very polarizing / popular movie that made Americans pay attention to Asian cinema. And for me, it was one of the first, well, not first, but it was one of the more, like, if we're talking about taking two things that don't quite belong together and melding them, for me, it was like, I got that same sense reading your short story. I really did, because I was like, what am I?
It's a high expectation.
Well, because one, it may be incumbent upon the class we were taking. It was full of, shall I say, the demographic of that class was more sappy and maybe quite depressing and sad. Because in a creative writing class, you are, first of all, you're in college, okay? Yeah, so funny. It's a very vulnerable, emotional time, and so without belaying the point, a lot of women and
I don't think that had anything to do with
not really. But again, the type of people that were in that class, like the English majors or whatever, it was a very specific. The point I'm trying to make is that it was a very specific demographic, and their literature was kind of all melding into one. But yours just stuck out like it stuck out like a sore thumb, for me.
It was funny because a lot of these people, were like really, really interested in writing something super literary and something that was like, you know, super introspective and philosophical. And I was right. I'm going to take Scarlet Pimpernel, my favorite adventure novel, and I'm going to do a steampunk version of that.
Right. And I love that because it came out of the blue. Everything else was like, it's very English-ese, you know, English major ease. And then Scarlet Citizen, steampunk boy tries to take down the opposition. I'm like, yes. Yes. All right. So switching over to your very recent endeavors, you were down in Los Angeles.
I was.
You were down in California, and the thumbnail that I'm using for this episode, I'll tell you right now. Look, when I saw that video, I got rather emotional. Because looking at your face right then and there, to our viewers, I would take a good look at the thumbnail, and that's a snapshot that I kind of screen capped from Luke giving a speech at the Writers of the Future Awards event. What was that like, Luke? That moment that you finally got there, you know? Because the day before, the post that kind of set that up, honestly, was you were taking a picture from your hotel room, and they were doing premieres for The Eternal.
Yeah.
And I was like,
that was
wow, like,
so weird.
Did you ever think 8 years ago that you'd be here?
Did I tell you Taika Waititi walked into the bar while I was there? Yeah,
Did you talk to him?
No, I didn't talk to him, but I was sitting in the bar writing, and like these people walked in, this group of people, and I noticed that like a lot of people were kind of gravitating to them and sort of like standing around chatting with them / listening to them.
That's LA.
Yeah, and I was just like sitting off in the corner writing, and then I didn't realize who it was until the next day. One of my other writer friends was there, came up to me and was like, "Hey, did you know that Taika Waititi and Gemma Chan were here in the hotel yesterday?" And I was like, Oh, that's why they looked familiar. But he to be fair to me, Taika looked pretty different in real life than I'm used to seeing him in interviews and stuff. So
did he look like the Dracula from What We Do in the Shadows?
No. He actually looked a lot more like respectable and like classic like Hollywood actor, you know, because he's actually a pretty good looking guy. Like he has the movie star looks.
He has all the chops, man. He can write, he can direct, he can act. Yeah. It's just like all in one.
But like I'm used to thinking of him as like this sort of wild-haired like poet, like scribe of our generation. But he actually looked like just like a pretty good-looking actor in the hotel. Yeah, it was interesting.
So what was it like, man? You traveled down there. How many times had you been to LA or California before?
So I've been.
Was it San Diego or LA?
It was Hollywood actually.
Hollywood, okay.
Yeah. So I've been to LA itself like twice in my life. I've been to California a few times because my family lives in San Diego. My mom's extended family, I mean. But I had never like been to Hollywood, and I had certainly never stayed in a hotel like this or like.
What was the hotel like?
So this was the hotel where the very first Academy Awards were held.
Wow.
So like Marilyn Monroe used to hang out at the pool.
What was the name of
this hotel? It's the Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel.
Ooh.
Yeah, it was fancy.
Was that clearly the most fancy hotel you'd ever been in?
By far.
What was that like? Well, because you are classy. Okay,
me?
Yes.
Oh my goodness, I have food stains on my pants right now.
No, you're classy, but you don't strike me as You're also very conservative with you're very frugal, and it's like you, and so to what we were discussing earlier about two things that don't really belong together, really, really, really fancy settings. It's just like I'm trying to picture it in my head at the moment.
Here's a story to illustrate how out of place I was.
Sure.
So, I didn't realize until about a week before going that they were not paying for our meals. They paid for 2 meals, which was very kind of them. And they were already giving us so much. They did not need to pay for our food. That was fine. But I just like hadn't budgeted for that and hadn't expected that. And so I was a little bit panicking because I can't pay Hollywood prices to eat at a restaurant every day.
Can you elaborate on Hollywood prices? What?
Like the drinks in the bar, like a basic drink was like $30, man.
Okay.
I cannot do this.
Perfect.
I ate out like a couple times,
Gotcha.
a few times, but yeah. So the first day though, when we got there, they took us on grocery trips, and so I was like, oh, this is great. So like this way I can actually afford to eat. So my roommate and I, we went to a place that everyone kept calling Ralph's, and then when we got there, it was a Kroger. I guess apparently California calls Kroger Ralph's, but it has Kroger brand food there. So
Really?
yeah, it was really interesting.
Okay.
But anyway,
Ralph's it is.
yeah, I guess it was purchased by Kroger. So my roommate and I went in and bought a bunch of food, but what we didn't realize is that in California you have to pay for plastic bags separately.
Yes.
And so we just like, which is a good thing, but we didn't like notice that on the checkout screen. So we just like didn't get any bags. And then we're just like looking down, and we have armfuls of like unbagged chickpeas and spinach and bread and peanut butter. And so we like go marching back into this hotel, these two Midwestern boys, like just with our arms full of canned goods, and there is a wedding going on.
Oh,
so we
perfect.
enter with like the train of guests who are all in like $2,000 like suits and dresses, and they're like sports cars pulling up outside, and we just like go marching through and are like smelling like the airplane with like our arms full of chickpeas. It was hilarious.
You just got like Kroger Select branded product just walking through the lobby.
I really wanted someone to like call us out on it and be like, what are you doing? And I would have said, we don't believe in using plastic, when in California. But,
oh man, yeah, I'm just looking at photos of the hotel. That is a very immaculate hotel. That looks wow.
It was
and
crazy.
So yeah, flying there with the express purpose of attending that kind of a conference. What was that like for you, man?
It was definitely intimidating. Because like I said earlier, there were so many good writers there. Both the judges, but especially like my fellow winners, were all just astoundingly good. There was a 16-year-old who won and has a story in my anthology, and I just read their story a few, like 2 days ago, and it was astoundingly awesome. It reminds me of the ending to the Graveyard Book / the ending to Gravity Falls, if you've seen that. Like, reading their story made me have all those same feelings of like how it feels to leave behind childhood and like grow up and things, and just like I didn't cry, but it left me like pretty shaken, so it was great.
Right. Awesome. Now, the awards night itself, like I looked at, it was a 3-hour affair or whatnot. So what was that like? You just had to like, cause I'm guessing you hide it very well. Like this snapshot of you and just like watching your speech, you hide it very well. But I'm gathering you were a little nervous.
Oh, I was so nervous.
That kind of crowd.
Yeah. So I forgot half the people I meant to thank in my speech, because every time people would applaud, the lights above me would brighten. I don't know why they did that, but like, yeah, that's just how their lighting works, I guess. So every time people would applaud, their lights would brighten, and I thought that they were telling me, oh, you need to hurry up and end your speech. And then afterwards I realized they just did that to everyone. But yeah, so I forgot to thank my parents. I forgot to thank my teachers. I forgot to thank the judges of the contest, and my illustrator, which is crazy because my illustrator won the grand prize for all the illustrators of my year. Everyone should look him up. His name is Daniel Watson. He has illustrated stories for Brandon Sanderson now. Like, he has drawn the end art for like one of Brandon Sanderson's books, which is amazing. Like, how many times have you heard me like rant about Brandon Sanderson, right?
Often.
Yeah.
Fairly often.
So anyway, but he illustrated my story, and I am incredibly honored by that. And yeah, he won first prize, and I forgot to thank him in my speech.
All right. Well, thank you, Dan Watson, for that. And it's a very immaculate painting I see here.
There's a color version in the front of the book, actually.
Yeah. Perfect. So it sounds like you're gonna have to rehearse. You're gonna have to.
I've rehearsed a few times, but yeah.
No, you're gonna have to get used to events like these.
Oh, I don't know about that. Actually, I kind of won't, because there's nothing like Writers of the Future in the realm of like sci-fi fantasy authors. It's like Writers of the Future is a fancier event than the Hugo Awards ceremony.
Oh,
And
wow.
I don't know if you are familiar with the Hugo Awards, but
Not quite.
that's the big award for writers. Like the Hugo and the Nebula Awards are like two of the biggest awards for writers in sci-fi and fantasy. And they don't have all this stuff that we got. It's just a really unusual like opportunity.
Yeah. the moment, harkening back to when I said I got a bit emotional, is when you said, and probably Luke, a lot of us here were emotional because we were watching and it's like, yeah, I submitted to this contest 14 different times, and then at that point they cut your speech off and the audience obviously applauded, and then the lights got a little brighter for you at that point. 14 different times, Luke. Like, how many? Well, what's the story behind that? And like that has to be one that's encouraging to other writers, you know.
On that note, actually, I need to thank you because you have helped me out so much with my my podcasts and my videos and everything. And like, I would have been a gibbering mess on stage if I hadn't had some sort of experience doing public speaking or doing interviews and stuff, and you've been so helpful with that. So thank you.
I appreciate it, man. I appreciate
it. Deeply grateful.
Happy to help.
Yeah, the 14 submissions, was that your question about?
Yes, 14. What was that like each time with each submission? Like, do you feel like you learned a little more? Because the first time, can you tell us a little about the first time you submitted?
Yeah. So, for people who don't know, Writers of the Future is a quarterly contest. So, you know, obviously 4 times a year you can submit, and they are judged by like some really amazing writers. Brandon Sanderson is a judge, Nandi Korafor is a judge, Dave Farland, just some really, really astoundingly good authors, Kevin J. Anderson. And so I submitted that Scarlet Citizen story that we talked about earlier, and I got that honorable mention back. And at that point, that was the first real encouragement that I had in the sphere of the publishing industry that I wanted to be in.
Right.
So I had a story published before that in like a flash fiction magazine. I had some things win some like student competitions, and I had even had like a novel win an Editor's Choice Award with a small Christian publisher, an unpublished novel that I didn't end up deciding to publish in the realm of like traditionally published like mainstream fantasy and sci-fi, which is a whole other thing because the pool of people who are trying to get in there is so much larger. And so this, I didn't win. I wasn't even published in it at this time, but the honorable mention told me that I was at least in the top 100 I knew. And it also told me that the judges like were trying to give me a nudge, like trying to say, hey, you're good enough to win this. Like, you need to keep submitting to this. So I, being my sort of arrogant / insecure self, I swore a rash oath unto Joni, the contest administrator, that I was going to submit every single quarter until I either died of old age or won or pro'd out, meaning like got too many professional publications to be eligible for Writers of the Future. And so I submitted every single quarter. I think all but like 1 or 2 quarters I submitted a new story, which I highly encourage people to do, like write new things every time. And I actually wrote more than the 15 or the 14 submissions, because I didn't submit every story I wrote.
Gotcha.
But yeah, I ended up being, I fell into this pattern of every other submission would win an honorable mention or something. And then the other ones I would experiment and do something more experimental. Like I would, write it from a really weird narrative point of view or something. Sorry, are we running long here?
No, absolutely not.
Okay.
Keep going.
I wasn't sure how long you meant for
it's
this
okay.
to be.
No, keep going. I'll cut this out too. Every once in a while, I'll look over at the monitor and I'll look at we're still getting audio levels just fine. But yeah,
gotcha.
That's honestly just fine. Keep going.
Gotcha. Okay, so every other submission would write something experimental, and that really pushed me as a writer. And by the time I finally won, I was starting to like escape that pattern. So my experimental stories were also starting to get honorable mentions. And my more traditional stories were starting to do better. They were getting silver honorable mentions, which is the next level. I got 1 semi-finalist certificate and found out that I was like 1 person away from being a finalist. Wow. Then I finally found out that I was a finalist and waited for the phone call, and then was told I won 2nd place for my quarter. So
wow.
Yeah. And I've had a lot of people like come up to me at like sort of the digital conventions I've attended since then, or a lot of people, like reviewers on Goodreads, have told me that they really enjoyed my story, which is high praise because all the stories in there are great. So
How do people, if you don't mind me asking, there, how do people come across your work? Because it's like, as someone that's outside that circle, outside that kind of literary, like new literary circle, like how do people come across these? So it kind of harkens on the importance of a compilation like this, Writers of the Future, or like other publications, or how does that work, and how do people find your work?
Yeah, so people can find my personal work just on my website, lukewildman.com. But as far as like big picture, that anthology, the Writers of the Future anthology, volume 37, they have a distribution network that I don't have. And so, I mean, that like no one has really, like even professional authors don't have a distribution network like they do. And so they like are able to get this book into all the bookstores. They can get it into international markets. Like plenty of their books have wound up as bestsellers on various bestseller lists. And so that is one great thing, is now my name is associated with that. And so hopefully that means like when I come out with my next book, I'll do a little better in the Amazon rankings than I would otherwise, because their algorithms are going to be like pushing me a little bit more than they would.
And do you get these metrics? Do you get the data like sent to you, or how do you keep your eye on that data? Like how often people are reading your stuff, or like the frequency of which people are finding your stuff?
Well, I can look at the data from my personal website and like podcasts and stuff. And there's a jump after winning Writers of the Future. I can tell a lot more people have been following me. But also I can just kind of keep my eye out on the bestseller lists. And because Writers of the Future is this unusual situation where it's a bunch of professionals who have taken it upon themselves to like mentor those of us who are just trying to make a name for ourselves, they like teach us about like the way the industry works. And I can still reach out to a lot of them and ask how these things work. So like David Farland is his pen name. He was Brandon Sanderson's mentor, and he mentored like Stephanie Meyer, he mentored James Dashner, a lot of great writers, and he knows more about the industry than like anyone I've heard talk at any point. He here's an example of how much he knows. At one point, Penguin Random House, or this wouldn't be Penguin Random House, this would just be, I'm not going to try to say the publisher because I can't remember. They came to him, and Scholastic, maybe, I don't know. Sure. They came to him and they asked him to look through the books that they had and select one to be their big book for the year that they would put their budget behind and push. And so he looked through the books, and there was some good stuff in there. Then he found one book that had this sense of wonder and this sense of like a new setting that a lot of would really grab kids, especially, and would really get kids excited about reading. Do you know where I'm going with this? This book that had a sense of wonder, had a unique setting, had a lot of magic in it. So he That's is crazy. The reason that they chose to push Harry Potter when they did. Yeah. It was already being pushed in the UK, but in the American markets, he was the one who selected it. Yeah. So, wow. So he knows a lot about the industry, and he gave us some classes on how to build our followings and grow. So
that's interesting. You talked about the release of Harry Potter, both because it was already boiling. Because we're talking about a period of time where the internet really wasn't a thing, Yeah. So figures like these. What was his name again?
His name is Dave Farland. Farland. That's his pen name.
His pen name. We'll just stick with his pen name for now. But figures like David Farland, the fact that it was circulating already in the UK circle. If it was today, it would have been by way of the internet and by way of networking, social networking. It would have found its way into the American circle rather easily.
But marketing budgets, the publishers still control a lot of that, even with the way things can go viral.
Right.
Actually, I learned some stuff that makes me really sad. So publishers intentionally do not let some books do well, like some of their own books that they publish.
I can imagine.
Yeah, they keep them as their bottom list or their mid list,
or like a blacklist or whatnot.
Well, yeah, a blacklist would be like a different thing. That would be like an author gets a bad name for themselves for like not being reliable.
So
or
the concept I'm thinking of is like blacklisting when scripts get blacklisted in Hollywood or like
Oh yeah.
That means they'll basically not produce it, but they'll keep it in their back pocket. But then whoever is in charge of like creatively is just left in the loop for however long. That's how Squid Game was conceptualized and had been written over 10 years ago. But
I didn't know that.
But they kind of, Squid Game now, I mean, it's a 90 million, it might be close to $100 million franchise at this point. But yeah, they, I'm sorry, 900 million.
Okay, I was thinking about those numbers and was like, wait a second.
Yeah, but yeah, blacklist, I guess, for Hollywood scripts isn't the same as a blacklisted author or like a concept.
Maybe,
so, yeah.
and maybe I'm using the terms wrong, I hadn't heard that about Squid Game, but actually that's really interesting because do you think if Squid Game had come out 10 years ago, would it have been as successful as it is now?
Clearly not, because the reason for that is because it's Netflix 10 years ago isn't what it is today.
Yes.
And on top of that, Netflix was struggling for a little bit because with the introduction of Disney Plus, other streaming platforms stepping up to their thing, Netflix, and this is kind of a little bit of a tangent, but Netflix lost a lot of the shows.
Mm-hmm.
They lost a lot of their Disney content.
Mm-hmm.
They lost a lot of, whatever else. Paramount started coming out with their own streaming platform as well as HBO Max. And so for Squid Game to come out now, I don't know if they were... It's still a gamble because the Asian market is not as prominent as... they probably were banking off the fact that, one, Parasite did extremely well.
Uh-huh.
This is all speculation. I probably put... If I was doing a video, I'd probably put speculation in why titles here. But because Parasite had done well, and people would anime has only gotten bigger and bigger and bigger by the year.
Yeah.
And so now I feel like the corporate houses at Netflix, they didn't even give that show that big of a budget, if you can believe it. The show had a measly budget for what it generated.
Yeah.
And that kind of forced. It's kind of a good thing because it forced the creators and it forced the filmmakers to really dig deep and portray and focus on good characters and good writing, even though regardless of what you think of the season,
I haven't seen Squid Game, but throwing money at something doesn't always guarantee that it'll be quality.
Not. Yeah.
Like
Cyberpunk.
Look at Game of Thrones, Cyberpunk, or look at like the transition from the first season of Game of Thrones, where their budgets weren't that large, but they used what they had very well to the 8th season.
So we were trying to apply that to the writing circle, and you say publishing houses or publications will purposefully not make or not market works as well, or not promote, or they kind of want the works to fail. Like, how can you elaborate on that a little more?
Yeah, I mean, so I shouldn't say they want them to fail, but they don't want them to distract from the books that they're actually trying to push.
Right,
and
right.
The hard thing for someone like me is that the way they choose which books they want to push is whether it's an author who's already had a lot of success. So it's kind of a catch-22 in some ways. You just have to get lucky and be smart and figure out how to be reliable and someone who's good to work with. But yeah, they will only put like, if they put any of their marketing budget towards like those smaller releases, it won't be that much. And that shows up especially with cover design. You can tell which books a publisher wants to be their big sells based on how good the cover is. So that blows my mind. They could actually it wouldn't be that hard for them to get a great cover for like almost every book they put out, but they want it to be, they want to draw the reader's eye to certain books on the shelf and not to other ones, but they still want to put out other ones because I think the reason is because they want to still be developing authors, because eventually their best-selling authors are going to age out and they're going to want to replace them. So they're building their crop. But in the meantime, it kind of screws some of those lesser authors over.
Right. What is some of that? You kind of already answered this question, but like how do they derive some of that data? And I know it probably gets very specific, and we're just speculating at this point. But how, in the sports world, there are athletes that you push because they have obvious value and trade value / tendencies / market value, right? But that like you were saying, it screws over some of the hardest working people, some of the hardest working people just trying to make it, who frankly deserve it, you know. And so how do you think some of that data is derived?
How do they decide which ones to push?
How?
Yeah,
What's the methodology?
What I've been told is, in addition to like your past success and whether your other books have sold well, a lot of it boils down to whether you are consistently putting out stuff that is of high quality. So I've often heard that it takes as many as like 8 books before a writer can really start to get noticed by their publisher. And you know, it's not all that common for a writer to actually be allowed to write a second book, like especially a sequel, because publishers don't necessarily want to take a chance on a sequel from a new unproven author. So what I've been told is you want to be putting things out regularly and quickly, but you don't want the quality to dip. So this is a big gamble what I'm doing, but my goal right now is I'm submitting. I have one book that is completely ready to be submitted. I've done a ton of work on it. I've done like
editing and
I've done like beta reading. I've done like 6 or 7 drafts at this point. I've done a lot of work on it. I've put together all the pitch materials. So I'm currently submitting that to literary agents, and at the same time I'm working on the sequel, which is a gamble, because if I can't sell this first book, then I'll have written a second book that I also cannot sell, and it'll take me even longer to get published. But I'm hoping that if I can sell this book, then I'll be able to immediately turn around and put out something that I've had time to polish to my standards of quality, you know. So that's my goal.
Awesome. Do you wow, there's so many comparisons that I can make there, because across different industries, it's unfortunately not uncommon, you know, for publishing houses to be. But what's the benefit of that in your opinion? Because they're
going with a traditional publisher,
or the benefit to your plan. I'm trying to dig at it a little bit, because you having write a sequel. Is there any way, like, if the plan goes awry, can you rework those concepts and like maybe, I don't know, make a spin-off? Is there and do you know of other people that do the same thing?
Yeah, I do. And no writing, you know, is wasted, because it's all practice and it's all like helping me refine my tool set, and also, you know, maybe giving me some ideas I can use later. Actually, some of the ideas in these books I cannibalized from something else I wrote on my second novel. So sorry, can you restate your question?
Your plan to by the way, which I don't think is ballsy at all, because like you were saying, like this is your craft. And by the way, like your sequel can be reworked, and it can be, it's like it's extra material, and frankly you're making lore for yourself that you can draw from,
right?
You know, so like one, like what are some very clear benefits to doing what you're doing, because there are, and then on top of that, like do you know of any other like authors that kind of do the same thing or have done the same thing? Like you just attended a conference, right? Have you heard of this kind of method from any other of your peers?
I have heard of it. So it's interesting. Some of the writers, like the professional writers at that conference, told me not to do this. And some of them told me absolutely do that. That's a great plan. So, you know, everyone
50-50,
everyone has different advice on what to do. I know of at least a few authors who are very successful, like Brent Weeks, who he wrote his first trilogy. He wrote all 3 books before getting the first one published. And like that's one of the things that convinced me to do this, is I looked at him and I looked at some other writers and the time frames that they used when coming out with their first trilogies and their first few books, like Brandon Sanderson. You know, he wrote 11 books before he got one of them published. So I'm on my 5th book, so I think I'm doing all right then. But readers love to see like that a writer isn't falling into the trap of like taking 10 years between books, which is, you know, no disrespect to the George R.R. Martins and the Patrick Rothfusses of the world. There's a reason they take that long, because they are producing stuff
projects
that I cannot do. No, it's not even that they're working on other projects, although that too in George R. R. Martin's case, and Patrick Rothfuss, but they are producing like prose and story at another level, you know. And so But yeah, I was looking at writers like Brent Weeks and seeing like the time frame in which he put things out and seeing how excited his readers were getting about that, and decided that like I wanted to, when I started my career, not just, you know, kind of have an insidious entrance to the industry. I wanted to like have a chance to make a bigger splash.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I will, but that's the goal.
Okay. Yeah. Well, here's a question I've been kind of wanting to ask, and I ask a lot of I ask different people of different occupations this all the time, because this is a career that you've been working on, and that you've trying to, you were saying earlier that you are now cracking into that sphere, right?
Just dipping my toes in it.
Yeah. You're dipping your toes, but hey, man, like, dude, it's a step. It's a giant step. You know, you've done the hard work. Now, the question is, how do writers make their money? Like, and this is kind of because this is kind of unknown and I asked this to athletes as well, you know, fighters that I've interviewed. They keep a day job, and at some point they transition over, like, and do this full time. How does a writer get paid? Like I say, you know, because you were, and what makes me think of this is you were talking about how publications will, you know, not want to take a chance on a book. When they take a chance on a book, do they support the writer at all? Like, how does a writer generate income?
Yeah, it really depends.
At certain levels, you know?
It really depends, because we talked about the writers who are able to like get a bigger part of that marketing budget. And it's the same thing with who they're giving the big advances to. It's those same people. So the publishing industry is really feast or famine. And again, keep in mind that like a lot of this is just like me regurgitating what I was told at this conference.
Sure.
So from some very great sources, but it's still, you know, just me repeating it secondhand. So there are writers who neither of us has heard of who are earning like hundreds of thousands, six figures a year, or even millions a year. Like, there are millionaire writers who no one has ever heard of, like especially indie authors, because, you know, people who publish on Amazon or whatnot, because they are able to get in a foreign market. That's a lot of how it works. Sales to foreign markets are huge. There are some indie authors who are like the best-selling authors in this tiny Eastern European country who in the States we have not heard of these people. And then alternatively to that, I met some people when I was at Writers of the Future who have won Hugo Awards and won Nebula Awards, like things that I fully expect I will never win. Like just like great writers who, you know, still have their day job and are happy with that. Like, they're happy to be able to produce art at the quality they want. I have discovered in myself an unexpected commercial streak, because you remember that I used to be all about like, oh no, it's all about the philosophy of the art. It's all about like, it's all about producing writing that enriches the soul. And now I have realized.
Wait, at what point were you like that? Was it earlier in our podcast, or was it like in college?
Oh no, like in college.
Oh,
and,
okay.
like,
I
for
don't
a long
really
time.
remember that.
In that creative writing class we talked about, I would write adventure fiction because everyone else was writing literary fiction, but then I will do stupid things like submit more like stories that I think of as literary to magazines that clearly only publish more adventure.
Oh, okay. So what you're saying is,
which I don't do anymore, to be clear.
Right.
But I did that for a long time.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm just kind of a contrarian. But I'm getting better about that, and I'm now realizing that I actually don't have to compromise like my vision of art and what it is in order to produce stuff that I think has a chance at selling well. And part of what has shown me that is that anthology, The Writers of the Future. I realized a lot of the other people did so many things better than me. They like produced stories that had like deeper messages. Their like world building was more complex. Like, some of their character motivations were deeper than mine. And I had tried to write those stories, and I had submitted plenty of that type of story to the contest. But I have gotten so many people who've now told me, and I'm sure all of us have, because all the stories in here appeal to a different demographic. But I have gotten like over a dozen people at this point who've told me that my story was their favorite. And I think a lot of why that is because it's a humorous story. Like it's just funny.
Yeah.
And it plays with like tropes and like just does amusing things that people enjoy. And so it's not the most artistically told story, and I don't have the skills that a lot of my contemporaries have. But I think I do have an ability to connect with readers in a way that is just entertaining and fun and makes them like feel good about what they're reading.
That's a great segue, honestly. Like, because you not compromising on vision, and even though you know the concepts or that you're trying to present are avant-garde, or shall we say, first of all, your story is a great read after Game of Thrones season 8. Like that's let me just put that right out there. It'd probably be like, wow, like
it's hilarious.
Great time to get into some good reading.
It's funny.
It's a great segue because the last thing that I want to talk about today and kind of explore, we've kind of danced around this for the past 2 weeks. We've had to reschedule this podcast quite a few times. So I've obviously had a bit more time to mull over the concept of this, but Dune.
Yes.
And it's
so
apt.
excited.
It's apt because you got to see Dune with
yes, I got to see it with Kevin J. Anderson, who is one of the co-authors of like the Dune prequels and the graphic novels, and just the extended universe. He co-writes them with Brian Herbert, who is the son of Frank Herbert, who obviously wrote Dune.
This is a blockbuster that I thought was gonna fail.
Really?
Yeah, and because Blade Runner 2049, which Denis Villeneuve also directed. I mean, do you know Blade Runner at all? The old Blade Runner movie. I've
seen the first one. I haven't seen 2049.
The first one is my favorite sci-fi of all time.
Yeah, I know.
And it bombed in the 80s.
Yeah.
And it's only apt that its sequel would bomb in 2017 when the movie was announced.
Did 2049 bomb?
It bombed.
Oh, I didn't know
that. It did not do well in the box office at all. So I had a lot of anticipation coming into this. I didn't read the book at all coming into this movie because I wanted to be blindsided by the concepts, blindsided by the art, and the fact that I knew that Denis was the director. And the reason I say it's one of the weirdest, most bizarre, yet easily the coolest like IMAX movie I've ever seen. First off, like they spared, in my opinion, they spared no expense making this movie from a craft and like just like artisan. High art meets blockbuster perspective, and that's just me though. But we're here to hear your opinion on it since you saw this movie with prior knowledge. How long ago had you read Dune?
So I read Dune. I want to say it was last fall. I read it because I thought I had never read it before, and I thought that I needed to like have some experience with it before the movie came out so I could have the nerd bragging rights. And then it blew me away so much that I actually immediately reread it. So I read it twice, both times. Like I'm a newcomer to the fold.
Yeah. So what'd you think? You saw the movie with how many times? Because I've
only seen it
I was
once.
so obsessed. I saw this at least twice. I would have seen it a third time if I had more time, but yeah. Kind of tell us about when you saw it, who you saw it with, and then like what was the feeling in the room / how did you internalize the movie?
Yeah. So I've only seen it the one time in Hollywood, and I saw it with the room full of writers. This was the very last thing we did together. The last thing of the week.
Wow, that was awesome. What a way to cap off the week.
Yeah, it was great. And as I say, Kevin J. Anderson was there. Brian Herbert was not there. I think because of COVID, it kept him away. But there were a few other writer, director people in the room with us. And so I was actually watching Kevin J. Anderson's face occasionally while we were watching it. I had like a good window through through people's heads to see him. Because I know that he and Brian Herbert were for 25 years trying to get the rights back to Dune to get this movie made.
Oh, wow. Can you tell us the story there? There was a point where the rights weren't.
Well, because there was the David Lynch version that was made. So I assumed that they had the rights for a while.
Wow.
And
so they had to fight for this.
Well, I don't know whether they had to fight or all I know is he said that it had been an emotional journey because it was 25 years of him and Brian Herbert working on this. And he told us a few stories about so he was a creative consultant on the movie.
Right.
You can see his name in the credits, pretty close to the beginning of the credits. And so he was like he would be traveling on book tour or whatever, and suddenly they would send him another draft of the script to look over and give his input in. And so he looked over like several hundred like drafts of the script by the time it was finished, you know? So he, actually, before we watched it, he told us that he had no idea which version of the script they used.
Wow.
And
Okay.
he said, so I really hope it's one of the good ones, because, you know, not all of them were great. So, yeah. Well, I shouldn't say he said not all of them are great. I don't remember him saying that. I do remember him saying that he hoped it was one of the good ones. So,
what kind of theater was this? Was it like a big old IMAX, or was it just a normal theater?
It was pretty much a normal theater.
Okay, no, I mean, that's all good. Well, because we're talking about one of the creative consultants of this movie, and the fact that, you know, and I don't know if I'm you'll have to forgive me there. I'm a film guy. I'm a movie cinema going guy, and this movie had the most IMAX shots ever in any movie. The fact that when I say IMAX, it's like 70 millimeter, and the people are just huge.
Yeah,
it takes up the whole screen. Dude.
And I've heard people say as well that because it was shot in IMAX, when you see it in the regular version, they have to like cut off parts of it, you know?
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me. That's crazy.
It makes like these giant panoramic shots like feel really squeezed. And, yeah. All right. So I'm probably not supposed to say this, but I don't care. I don't think I'll get in trouble for it. So we watched
what was
it.
Yeah. Their honest feelings. Well, you know.
Oh well, no, not sure. Okay, I'll go there. So my impression was that it was one of the best adaptions of a book I've ever seen.
Really?
Like a remarkably faithful adaptation, like as faithful as the Lord of the Rings movies were, probably more so actually, because they took direct. I mean, so did Lord of the Rings, but they took direct dialogue from moments in the book, like, you know, from like some of those fight scenes and stuff, and just like put it into the movie script, which may be good, maybe not good. My impression was that it was a great adaptation, but not that good a movie. Like, I actually felt like,
you know what? You may have a point there.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I felt like I know that they were trying very hard to make it accessible to people who hadn't read the book too. And I didn't think they succeeded at that. Which isn't necessarily their fault. It's such an in-depth, dense world. I mean, he's the master at world building.
Frank Herbert.
But I will say I've now heard other people who hadn't read it before watching it disagree with me and say that they like felt completely like it was a great intro to newcomers. So
yeah, that's I can objectively, you know, I think we can objectively say like the movie kind of it falls flat, especially the second half of the movie after, you know, Leto. I mean, spoilers. After Leto Atreides is killed and whatnot, like it kind of, and the fact that the movie ends with Zendaya, Zendaya's character saying this is only the beginning. That's like that's a trope. I can't. I echo one of my favorite critics, YMS Adam from YMS on YouTube. That really bothered him, and now I think about it, like that really bothers me too. The fact that, you know, because and this kind of ties into the fact that I was worried for this movie. I was worried. For many different reasons, because for a while a part 2 wasn't pending. The movie had to do well. It had to succeed for it to get the green light, and it has been.
Nice.
More than like that to me is bizarre.
Which,
you know?
I guess that goes into an interesting discussion about whether artists should just focus on producing the art they want to produce and not care about the constraints of the market, and not like try to ignore how things are going to perform, which it sounds like is what he did with Blade Runner 2049 as well, and or whether they should, like, you know, keep other factors in mind while they produce things.
Well, because Dune has been what we all know about the David Lynch movie, which, by the way, I think people are entirely too harsh.
Okay, I was about to ask you what you thought about that.
Yeah.
Because...
I take my words with a little bit a grain of salt and a bit of a caveat, because I've really only seen clips from it. I've seen a lot of in-depth study and analysis of it. I think at some point I do need to sit down and watch it.
I would be down for watching it with you too.
Oh, absolutely. I'd be down to see it. But here's the deal. I think people are of the clips that I've seen and everything that I've witnessed surrounding that movie that came out in freaking 1984, the same year, roughly around the same time that Blade Runner came out. I think people are entirely too harsh with him, because David Lynch is a terrific director, but Dune having to compact, this is why I think they made it a part one, like only half, just to be able to have everything land. What you're saying about how Denis Villeneuve's this movie doesn't quite achieve movie greatness, it's not objectively that good of a movie because it kind of cuts a lot of corners. It's a lot of interesting exhibition dump. It's weird, but the main question I have for you there is it quintessentially Dune?
It is absolutely Dune. It's Dune,
and that's 100%. All I need it to be.
Yeah.
I went into it just blind, not wanting to know anything, because I'm reiterating this point, just to be bewildered by the movie. And boy, was I. Yeah. Because I knew this. Just look, there's in the past, there's a director by the name of Alexander Jodorowsky, right? And there's a whole documentary on Jodorowsky's Dune. The fact that this really avant-garde guy.
I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, Jodorowsky is I think I'm butchering his first name. Alejandro Jodorowsky. There was a documentary that came out called Jodorowsky's Dune. Came out in 2013, and Alejandro Jodorowsky is a very he's a very very high art. Hard to access movies. Yeah. Meaning, like, his movies are going to challenge you. Yeah. The Holy Mountain, the movie came out in the 70s, really challenges a lot of religious beliefs and has a lot of political commentary. But his imagery, he's a very experimental / you would say avant-garde French-Chilean filmmaker. His movies are very, very challenging and borderline obscene for a lot of different people. His images bother people. But he wanted to make a Dune movie. Yeah.
And didn't he put together like a concept book, a binder, and it just like went on auction or something, I think. Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting.
The studios, it just never manifested because this movie is this experience, Dune, Frank Herbert's Dune, is so dense.
Would take so much money to fund it properly.
Absolutely.
Like a studio probably isn't going to give that to someone who produces like fringed things that maybe don't have a mainstream audience. Yeah. Which is maybe sad. But I'm glad about the version we got. But the reason I really wanted to ask you about David Lynch's version is because I know you're a film guy. You know a lot about just like the mechanics of movie making. And I have noticed in every podcast I've listened to, in every interview I've listened to about Dune, the people who know about film, they all give a lot of respect to David Lynch's version, including the podcast I listened to with, I can't pronounce the director's name, Denis Villeneuve.
It's kind of a French.
I'm sorry, French people.
Denis Villeneuve and Christopher Nolan, right?
Yes, and Christopher Nolan. They were talking about it together in a podcast, and they both gave a lot of credit to David Lynch's version, and we're like, oh, it does so many things so well. This isn't like, we don't even consider this movie to be better. We just consider it to be a different adaptation.
Oh, wow. Denis said that? That's very sweet of him. That is very, very sweet. He's a very kind man.
He seems like it.
He is... One, he's very well read. He read the book in his interviews that I've seen. He read the book at 14, and the scene that really encapsulated... I ought to send this to you, and everyone should go check it out. But Vanity Fair did a scene breakdown. He did a scene breakdown on Vanity Fair about the box scene.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and that is a terrific scene in the movie. It gets me thinking, because it really kind of...
chilling, too.
It's not quite the same as the book. And if we're being honest, I saw scenes of David Lynch's Dune that kind of captures a little more of what of what the book actually is. But Denis' difference is that he made the Bene Gesserit mother, in my opinion, a lot more intimidating, a lot darker, like an ancient grandma.
She's pretty scary in the first.
She is very scary in the book.
But yeah, there are moments where she almost feels like the sort of cackling old witch that you get from a lot of stuff.
uh the actor for the Reverend Mother is not a cackling woman at all.
No.
Is she like her last words to Paul, or in the movie at least, in part one, or "I hope you live." That's
Yeah.
it, and turns away. Her entrance to the planet is from this otherworldly, other universally looking a vehicle.
Yeah.
And just like you see nuns stepping out, and it's just like it's this weird energy surrounding.
It's the perfect tone setter for a science fantasy, as opposed to science fiction, or hard sci-fi or whatever. Because Dune, it has the space travel and stuff, but it also has like these great houses and like Game of Thrones sort of politics, except obviously it long predates Game of Thrones. And it has it has prescience and quasi magic. It's the precursor to Star Wars and stuff like that.
Right.
So,
It's like a celebration of the humans, of the human mind and the human spirit.
That's the difference between science, like hard sci-fi, and like science fantasy or space opera. Is like space opera and science fantasy it focuses more on the people, and like you just said, on like the human spirit, which sci-fi also does, and science fantasy also has some technology in it, but like by and large, hard science fiction is focused on the technology and the concepts, and like figuring out like what would this world look if it was a ring around a sun or whatever,
Yeah. Just the concepts. There are so many different concepts in this story that I read and I watch, and I just think to myself, like, this guy really did this in the 60s. He really, well, and doing my research on Frank Herbert, it turns out he's a very, very well researched biologist.
He's an ecologist and a biologist. Yeah.
And so he kind of drew inspiration from a lot, like,
and the movie
whole concept.
Got that.
Yeah,
like with the mouse, the shot of the sand mouse
with the water on the
using
mouse,
its ears to collect dew.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's awesome.
Crazy. And I think the imagery that really sunk in. This movie, Denis Villeneuve's movie, made me want to read Dune, which I think succeeded. Like that to me is the true success of a movie book adaptation, if it makes you want to read the source.
And on my flight back from Hollywood, I saw several people carrying around copies of Dune, reading it.
Now, guilty as charged, because that's like, I don't feel like you should have to watch a movie in order to read, in order to experience a book, but it really does help to have some context going into it.
Yeah, it depends on the person.
Yeah, because like the whole, and obviously the image that you gathered, what was the image? I asked this to people who are able to read books before they see the actual movie, but what was the image you had of the Dune universe, and like comparatively to what you saw Denis Villeneuve achieve? Like what were some of the key differences that you had?
Differences, great question.
Yeah, so like how everything from how the Bene Gesserit look to how the the ships look to how the shields are supposed to look, or how Duncan Idaho in Denis Villeneuve's movie is basically just Jason Momoa being Jason Momoa.
Some differences, but yeah.
And the fact that the book describes Gurney Alec as a toad or as a lamp shade of a man, when he's really played by the actor for Thanos. Yeah. And the actor for Thanos does not look like a lampshade of a man. He looks really cool, with that scar still.
Yeah. All right. Let's see.
Kind of putting you on the spot a little bit.
No. That's great. This is partially a visual thing, but I think one of the things that is just inherently lost in the adaptation is the book has that omniscient point of view, and so the way the book does tension is so effective because you have the spy. Sorry, am I?
I've already made a.
Giving you spoilers.
Yeah, I've already made a spoiler note, but you're talking about Dr. Yue, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And actually, what am I saying? You would know he's the spy because it's omniscient and you're in his head. Yeah. That's the whole point. So the book is so effective at creating tension in scenes that would otherwise be just like a lot of dialogue and monologue and exposition, because you're like not just getting Paul's thoughts, not knowing about the spy, you're getting like Dr. Yue. You know that there is, who the spy is.
It's pending,
and it's the tension of who is going to figure that out. So it's a book that is not focused on twists, and by the nature of it, because of prescience and because of that omniscience, it is a book where what's going to happen, and the tension comes with how will it happen?
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing that was different. As far as the visuals of it, I mean, it's hard to say that the first shot of the house, where
you know well, you mean you got the Atreides line just all lined up, and they're taking the servant from the Padisha Emperor is like reading like the scroll thing.
No, actually, sorry. When they first arrive on Arrakis, and like the house didn't look
as
exactly as I expected. I mean, I didn't expect immaculate.
But you know, I mean, everything from like there was a secret garden that was never really manifested in the book.
That was one thing. That was one thing. Yeah. The Hunter Seeker looked a little different from how I imagined it.
Oh, really? How did you imagine it looking?
Maybe I just wasn't paying attention when I was reading it, but I imagined it being more serpentine. And it was like a mosquito, which is probably more accurate to the book. But it's just, yeah. Let's see. The Baron was on point.
Really? Awesome. So Stellan Skarsgård really like delivered on the Baron.
So good. I think his nephew looked a little different from what I expected. You know, he's
Piter.
Yeah.
Well, because he. Oh, but man, the first time I saw the Baron I really thought the dude was just flying, dude.
Yeah.
I was so lost in the lore.
He was. Yeah.
Well, because in the. Isn't it described in the book, and you can kind of see hints of it in the movie, he's basically held up by a giant apparatus, right?
So it's not a giant apparatus, it's
like a mechanical thingy that attaches to his back.
Well, so he has small, like, little thrusters, and it's because he's so overweight, so obese. He has, like, thrusters that hold up the various parts of him, so like attached to like his folds,
right?
And stuff. So it's not like one giant jetpack. It's like it's like a bunch of small ones that makes him kind of bounce as he walks, you know. And the movie was brilliant in having him use that to escape the poison. That was a brilliant change.
I was so
awesome.
I was confused as to what he was doing, because I didn't see like a mechanical arms holding him up there. It's just like thrusters basically, and
it's like and they're hidden beneath his robe, so that's why you wouldn't notice it. But according to the book, at least he has like a bunch of tiny little propulsion things attached to him. So yeah. Oh, you asked about visuals that were different.
Sure.
The biggest single one for me was the still suits. I imagined them not having any bit of their skin exposed to the wind or the dust or the elements. I imagined them completely encased from head to toe in like almost like a wetsuit or like a mech, like a wetsuit that has like more of a mech apparatus to it. And then in the movie, what it actually was like there were some like body pads and stuff, but it was mostly just like the nose thing. Which I'm glad they got that in there, because that's significant.
And the blue eyes of the Fremen, and
that was perfect.
They had to achieve on that. What did you think of the? I mean, there's a lot I want to pick at your brain, and this is the time to do it, you know. But I know. Are you pressed for time?
We're good. Yeah.
Okay. Just a little more, just like maybe 10 minutes more.
Yeah,
but oh man, one of the more wilder concepts I really liked was the fact that they didn't show the worm. They really didn't show a whole lot of it. If the only time you see it like out in blue is at night. And it kind of still conceals its mystery, you know.
And that's so powerful because I mean they showed it sort of when it ate the sandcrawler. But that is so powerful to leave it to our imagination.
Yeah.
Because whatever the viewer or the reader imagines is going to be more like impressive and intimidating than like the visuals they can create.
And they did the same thing for the Spacing Guild.
They never show us the inside of the spaceships.
Because I've seen scenes of David Lynch's, and the creatures that control the Spacing Guild at this, because the lore is I guess they're so consumed with spice, and spice has changed their body so much. It's really I love that he made that mysterious. Now we may still get an interpretation. We may still get like a visual effect of it in the next movie.
It's really hard to say.
But I like that he left a lot of it to mystery. And Sardaukar, very like that 1 minute of the chant.
Those were a bit different from what I imagined too.
The chants, just you saw the human sacrifices. Like to me, like whoa, like They managed to squeeze some like Viking kind of stuff in there as well. Like,
and that's like, do you know the theory that Frank Herbert was drawing on?
No.
We're gonna have to Google it because I can't remember. But the fall of the Roman Empire, like look that up. There's an old
sure.
book. Maybe even Google Frank Herbert's name with it.
Okay, but yeah, what's
what
the
book
idea?
Comes up? It's not William Gibson. That's Neuromancer, but it was something similar to that. The author. So it was this idea that came out sort of like quite a while ago, and for a long time it was the predominant theory behind the fall of the Roman Empire. The idea was that Rome eventually grew soft. They grew too decadent, and they ceased to have like that roughness that created their like amazing armies, and so their armies grew soft and were no longer able to like, you know, to keep the barbarians at bay and whatnot. And that's been widely debunked at this point.
Might be a question for Joseph.
Yeah, and I mean, he and I have talked about this actually. Yeah, it's been widely debunked because, like, firstly, like Rome's armies when they fell were like quote unquote barbarians. Like they were people coming from the Germanic tribes and coming from like all over. They were the same people who were invading them, like just, you know, in different contexts. And so some history buff is gonna scream at me. I'm probably getting some stuff wrong or oversimplifying something, but anyway. So anyway, it's been debunked. But Frank Herbert, at the time when he was writing, that was still the predominant theory, and so he drew really heavily on that idea in that book. And so the Sardaukar. Wait, do you care about spoilers for
going into the part 2 or whatever?
It will be going into part 2. Yeah. I can avoid them. That's all right.
Honestly, not really.
No? Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So, you know, the Sardaukar are this impressive fighting force because they come from this planet that's really intense conditions. They're basically like fighting pits. They're pitted against each other from birth, basically. But the idea is the Fremen are actually like so much, they're the same level, more advanced than the Sardaukar as the Sardaukar are to regular soldiers.
Wow.
And the reason for that is because the Fremen are in a planet that is even harsher, even rougher conditions, and they have to survive Arrakis. Yeah. And the Sardaukar have grown decadent. There's some ideas of
they don't seem decadent in part 1 at all.
Yeah, so like their decadence is, you know.
Well, no, they don't seem soft. They don't seem soft at all in part 1. They're not terrifying.
Yeah,
you know? Like Sardaukar, the beam that they use to break down the door, or the beam that Duncan Idaho narrowly avoids. I'm like, dude, these guys are freaks. And the fact that they're in the movie, like it was one of my favorite scenes is Piter talking to the Sardaukar general or whatnot. The fact that they kind of muffle his voice, because if you read his lips, he's just saying the actor is just speaking normal English.
Oh, really?
But in the movie they break it down like Sardaukar. I'm like, oh wow, that's really cool. It's like a combat language that's like maybe indistinguishable and not the enemy can't decipher it. Because they are the Emperor's swords, right?
Yeah,
so it's really the whole art. The concept of the Sardaukar was like, whoa, like, damn, that's kind of mind blowing to me. An army. Yeah,
and they are pretty cool. You know, they're Praetorians basically. They're the Praetorian Guard, or to the Ottoman Empire, they are the Janissaries. They're the people taken from other places who've been made into the elite fighting force of the empire, and they're the Emperor's Guard, but they've gained so much power on their own now that they've started to be a target for politics. I thought
you were kind of wrapping up the discussion a little bit. The movie has to choose a perspective, right? The movie had to, and obviously that perspective was Paul. Yeah, you know, because like and it had to.
Paul in the Jessica. Movie. Jessica, I would say, is just as much of a...
Rebecca Ferguson as Jessica was terrific, in my opinion. Like, she stole the show.
I think she was the highest point of the movie.
She conveyed the box scene where, you know, she has to stand outside the door, and the very famous line in the book and the movie is like, "I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer."
Yeah.
You know, fear is the tiny little death that brings total obliteration. Like, to me, the fact that she was stuttering over that, like and then you eventually see her eyes like roll up, like, no, I've controlled this. You know?
Yes.
The fact that if he dies in there, dude, like I'm dead. This whole empire is dead, and yeah, it's gonna be chaos.
Yeah,
you
like
know?
her acting, because she wasn't in like the physical conflicts like Gurney Halleck or whatever. She just had to have this depth of like subtlety in all her scenes where she communicates. Because Jessica's arc is mostly internal, you know.
Yeah.
And actually Paul's is as well. But her arc is mostly internal, and so she had to like communicate all of that struggle and that fear just like through like minute like facial expressions and stuff. It was astounding.
Yeah. So yeah, I in wrapping up, I can very much see how like this inspired so many different other sci-fis. Like this, dude, Naboo or sorry, Tatooine is Arrakis.
Yeah.
You know, the freaking worms,
So much
Arrakis.
stuff.
You know, like the fact that it became it. I heard kids say, "Oh yeah, this reminds me of Star Wars." I'm like, no, guys, Star Wars reminds you of Dune.
Yeah.
You know?
And going back actually, the opposite direction, I just found this out, and I should have guessed it before, but a lot of Dune is based on or influenced by Lawrence of Arabia.
Oh, yeah.
I've actually never seen that.
Old movie,
on
yeah.
my list
Oh,
for
it's
a while.
terrific.
Another one I desperately need to watch it.
Come over and watch it. It's awesome.
I'd love to.
Let's
yeah.
do it.
Let's do it. But you know, it's the idea of there's like sort of, I mean, this is a bad thing to bring up right at the end, but there's
awesome.
the white savior like narrative going in there, and the person coming from another culture who like falls in love with this culture and thinks maybe I can be the one to save this, and then realizes, oh wait, the most I can be for this place is a vessel to like help them be what they already are.
Yes.
Essentially.
Yeah.
Which I don't want to use that as like a defense of the white savior mechanism, because there is a lot of that in there as well. But
yeah. Well, from everything I'm hearing about what happens later on in the book, like it takes a little bit of an interesting. The book Dune, as you had established earlier, it's not a book really of twists and turns, but the direction that Paul's going in is kind of like, hey, I don't know if he's really at this point where I am. I don't know if he's really supposed to be this big old savior. I feel like Frank is really trying to manipulate me at the moment into thinking he's something that he isn't really, you know. So in closing, I think the movie, it's I can understand the perspectives of people that didn't like it at all, because it's either, and that to me I think it's a mark of a great franchise / series or concept, is if people really like it or people really hate, or people are indifferent towards it. There's no in between. There's no like, meh, it didn't do anything for me. And for the most people, I know they've kind of really gravitated towards it, and they want more, you know?
Yeah. I think the majority of people seem to be big fans of it.
Yeah. And so I mean, going into hopefully part 2 will come out in 2 years, and we'll maybe have a better idea of how to gauge both this movie and the movie adaptations as a whole, you know.
And who knows what else is going to come out now? Maybe they'll make a new Sisterhood of Dune show, or I
wouldn't mind a whole series just about the Bene Gesserit. That stuff, that to me, I was so intimidated, you know, just the last little spiel about the movie, but the voice scared the crap out of me in the theaters, because it's so loud for one, but like, man, that's a freaky concept, the fact that you can control someone by the pitch of your voice. And just like the fact that Paul didn't whip that out in his battle with one of the Fremen brothers.
And he tries, but he's not able to.
Well, in that, you know, he's grabbing onto his Shaiud, and like he has to kill.
Oh, right, that part.
When that guy invokes like whatever call, because he's like butthurt because the guy Rebecca Ferguson took over the head guy pretty easily, heavy-handedly or whatnot. So yeah, great movie. I would recommend it. I'd recommend it for people. I'd also double, more so than the movie, try to read the book. Yes. It's a dense read, but if I can get through it, if I can try to get through it, most people can definitely fly through it. I would say. Luke, thank you so much for joining me today, man. Let's kind of wrap up with how can people find the Writers of the Future compilation? Like, what will be the best way to get to it, and your works in general? Yeah,
so it's Writers of the Future Volume 37 is the one that mine is in. But I also encourage people to buy Volume 36 because I met a lot of awesome people who were published in that one. And People can get a hold of this on Amazon. You can buy it in most bookstores or order it through most bookstores. Yeah, those are probably the simplest ways for people to do it. And I hope that I would love for people to also follow my website, lukewildman.com.
LukeWildman.com, your website. Is there are all kind of your works on there as far as like it's just like do you also give writer's advice to people on that forum? Because I know you write blog posts from time to time.
Yeah, I have a few blog posts there and some accompanying YouTube videos that you've helped me make that talk about how people can have success if they're interested in winning this contest, which is a great opportunity for other aspiring writers. So yeah.
All right, well, awesome. Duke, thanks again for joining me. Thanks.
Thank you.
I really, really appreciate it. Well, guys, that's been an episode of the Crunchy Tape podcast. As always, you can check the podcast out on a streaming platform of your choice. We're on YouTube, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and just about Radio Public, any other podcast streaming platform of your choosing. I want to thank you guys for joining us today. And if you like what you've heard, please consider subscribing and following. And as always, have a good rest of your week. Take care, guys.